Have you ever held something in your hands that shouldn't exist? I'm not talking about advanced technology or alien artifacts. I'm talking about a piece of gazelle skin, faded and fragmentary, covered in lines and notations that were already ancient when most of the world still believed the Earth was flat. What if I told you there's a map drawn in 1513 that shows coastlines no European had ever seen? What if that map depicts a continent that wouldn't officially be discovered for another 300 years? And what if that same map shows this frozen wasteland as it might have appeared, thousands of years before ice ever covered it? You're probably thinking this sounds impossible, and you'd be right to think that. Every conventional understanding of history, exploration, and geography tells us this can't be real. Yet the map exists. It sits in a museum in Istanbul, carefully preserved behind glass, quietly challenging everything we thought we knew about the Age of Discovery. Tonight, I want to take you on a journey into one of cartography's deepest mysteries. We're going to examine the Piri Reis Map, explore the impossible coastlines it depicts, and ask questions that historians have been avoiding for decades. We'll look at other ancient maps that show similar anomalies, dive into theories about lost civilizations and forgotten exploration, and consider the possibility that human history might be far stranger and far older than we've been taught. Before we begin, if you're drawn to mysteries that refuse to stay buried, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Helps more people find their way to these strange corners of history. And because I'd love to know who's exploring these questions with me across the world, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what hour it is where you are. I find it fascinating. Imagining all of us scattered across time zones, connected by our curiosity about what lies hidden in history's shadows. Someone in Tokyo at dawn, someone in London at midnight, someone in Sao Paulo as the afternoon fades. All of us here, now, wondering about the same old map. This isn't a story with easy answers. It's not going to wrap up neatly with certainties and conclusions. What we're diving into tonight exists in that strange space between documented fact and tantalizing possibility, between what we can prove and what we can't quite explain away. So settle in, let your mind drift a little, and let's see where these ancient lines on gazelle skin lead us. Maps are strange objects when you really think about them. They're representations of reality, attempts to capture the world on a flat surface, to compress vast distances and complex geographies into something you can hold in your hands. But they're also more than that, aren't they? Maps contain knowledge. They preserve discoveries. They carry the accumulated wisdom of everyone who came before, distilled into lines and symbols and careful notations. When we look at an ancient map, we're not just seeing geography. We're seeing what someone knew, or thought they knew, about the shape of the world. We're seeing the limits of exploration, the edges of the known. And sometimes, just sometimes, we see something that doesn't make sense. Something that shouldn't be there. A coastline that wasn't supposed to be discovered yet. A level of detail that requires technology the mapmaker couldn't have possessed. Knowledge that, by all rights, should have been impossible. The Piri Reis Map is one of those impossible objects. When you first see it, it might not look extraordinary. It's roughly 3 feet by 2 feet, drawn on gazelle parchment, colored with vegetable dyes that have faded over the centuries into soft browns and pale blues. Only about 1/3 of the original map survives. The rest was lost to time, fire, perhaps, or simple neglect. What remains shows the Atlantic Ocean, the western coast of Africa, the eastern coast of South America, and, at the bottom, a mysterious landmass that has sparked more controversy than perhaps any other feature on any ancient map. The map was created by Piri Reis, an Ottoman admiral and cartographer, in 1513. In his own notes scrawled across the map's margins, Piri explains that he compiled it from about 20 older sources. 8 of them were maps from the time of Alexander the Great, based on the ancient Greek geographer Ptolemy's work. 4 were Portuguese maps, recently made from new explorations. 1 was an Arabic map, and, remarkably, 1 was drawn by Christopher Columbus himself, a map that no longer exists anywhere else. Think about what that means for a moment. Piri Reis had access to a Columbus map that has since vanished from history. His copy of it is the only record we have of what Columbus himself drew after his voyages to the New World. That alone makes the Piri Reis Map invaluable, a window into knowledge that would otherwise be completely lost. But it's not what makes it mysterious. What makes it mysterious is what appears at the southern edge of the map, a coastline. Mountains depicted in the traditional medieval style, small triangular peaks marching in rows, rivers flowing from those mountains down to the sea. Geographic features drawn with surprising accuracy, surprising specificity, features that some researchers believe show Antarctica, not the Antarctica we know today, buried under miles of ice 2 miles thick in some places. Antarctica as it might have appeared thousands of years ago, when parts of its coast were still visible, still accessible, still warm enough to explore. Now here's where things get complicated. Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until 1820, more than 300 years after Piri Reis drew his map. The first confirmed sighting was by Russian explorers Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen and Mikhail Lazarev, whose ships pushed through the southern ice fields and glimpsed the frozen continent through the mist. The first landing didn't happen until even later, so how could a map from 1513 show Antarctic coastlines? The standard explanation, the one most historians and cartographers give, is that it doesn't. They argue that what looks like Antarctica is actually a distorted representation of South America's southern coast. They point out that 16th century maps were often imprecise, that coastlines were exaggerated or warped by the limitations of Portolan projection methods, that cartographers frequently filled in blank spaces with speculation and educated guesswork. They suggest that Piri Reis was simply extending the South American coastline further south than it actually goes, perhaps combining multiple source maps that didn't quite match up, creating a confused jumble of geographic features that only appears to show something it doesn't. And maybe they're right. Maybe this is all a case of misinterpretation, of seeing patterns where none exist, of finding mystery in what's really just medieval cartographic confusion. That would be the simple answer, the safe answer. But then why does the map show mountains in positions that match Antarctic mountain ranges? Why are there rivers flowing from those mountains to the coast, exactly where Antarctic rivers would have flowed if the continent weren't frozen? Why does the coastline, when overlaid with modern maps of Antarctica's subglacial topography, align with what researchers call eerie precision to features we only discovered with 20th century seismic equipment and satellite imaging? Perhaps it's coincidence. Human brains are pattern-seeking machines, after all. We find faces in clouds, messages in static, meaning in randomness. We're wired for it. It kept our ancestors alive, helped them spot predators in the undergrowth, recognize friend from foe at a distance. Maybe we're doing the same thing with this old map, projecting our desire for mystery onto ambiguous lines. Or perhaps there's something else going on. Something that suggests our understanding of history, of exploration, of who knew what and when, might need adjusting. The Piri Reis Map isn't alone, you see. There are other maps, other fragments from other times that show similar anomalies. Maps that depict lands that supposedly hadn't been discovered yet. Maps that show ice-free coastlines in regions that have been frozen for millennia. Maps that demonstrate mathematical projections and cartographic sophistication that shouldn't exist in their time period. Tonight, we're going to look at these maps together. We're going to examine what they show, consider how they might have been made, and explore what they might mean. We're not going to jump to conclusions. We're not going to claim certainties we don't have. But we are going to ask questions. Important questions. Questions about whether the age of exploration began much earlier than we think. Questions about whether ancient civilizations possessed knowledge we've lost. Questions about what lies buried beneath Antarctic ice, waiting to tell us stories we've forgotten. So let's start at the beginning. Let's go back to October 9th, 1929, when a German theologian named Gustav Adolf Deissmann was cataloguing old manuscripts in the basement of Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, and stumbled across a fragment of gazelle skin that would change everything. Istanbul, in 1929, was a city caught between empires. The Ottoman Empire had collapsed just years earlier, dissolved in the aftermath of World War I, and Turkey was reinventing itself under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. The Topkapi Palace, once the glittering seat of sultans who ruled an empire stretching from Algeria to Yemen, from Hungary to Iraq, was being converted into a museum. Its vast collections, accumulated over centuries of conquest and rule, needed cataloguing. Manuscripts, maps, administrative documents, royal decrees, all of it had to be sorted, identified, preserved. And that's where Gustav Adolf Deissmann came in. Deissmann was a German theologian, a scholar of ancient texts, someone accustomed to sifting through old manuscripts looking for fragments of forgotten knowledge. When the Turkish Ministry of Education asked him to help catalogue the palace's collection, he probably expected to find religious texts, Ottoman administrative documents, perhaps the odd illuminated manuscript. What he found instead was a map that would consume academic discourse for decades and spark controversies still raging today. The map was damaged, obviously. Large portions were missing, torn away or simply dissolved back into dust over the centuries. But what remained was extraordinary. It showed continents, coastlines, islands. There were notations in Ottoman Turkish describing various lands and peoples, notes about what could be found where, details about currents and winds. And when Deissmann looked closer, when he started translating those careful Ottoman script annotations, he realized what he was holding. This wasn't just any map. This was a map that referenced Christopher Columbus, a map that claimed to show the New World based on sources that included Columbus's own lost charts. Deissmann immediately recognized the historical significance. Here was a direct link to Columbus, preserved by an Ottoman admiral most Europeans had never heard of. He shared his discovery with colleagues, and word began to spread through academic circles. Within months, the map had attracted international attention from cartographers, historians, and anyone fascinated by the age of exploration. But who was Piri Reis? And how did he come to create such a remarkable map? Piri Reis, whose full name was Hagji Ahmed Muhyiddin Piri, was born around 1465 in Gallipoli, in what is now Turkey. His uncle, Kemal Reis, was a famous naval captain, and young Piri followed him to sea at an early age. This was the Mediterranean of the late 15th century, a dangerous frontier between a Christian and Muslim worlds, where naval power meant everything. They weren't always working for the Ottoman government, strictly speaking. In those days, the line between naval officer and pirate was thin and constantly shifting. The Reis family engaged in both legitimate military service and, let's call it, less legitimate raiding of Christian shipping. Sometimes you're serving the Sultan, sometimes you're serving yourself. The sea didn't much care about the distinction. During his years at sea, Piri collected maps, lots of them. Whenever his uncle's ships captured enemy vessels, Piri would search for charts, navigational tools, any geographic information he could find. He was fascinated by cartography, by the challenge of representing the world accurately, by the accumulated knowledge preserved in these carefully drawn documents. In one battle, according to accounts that have come down to us, Piri's uncle captured a Spanish sailor who had sailed with Columbus on his voyages to the Americas. This sailor possessed, or had access to, maps drawn by Columbus himself. Somehow, Piri Reis acquired copies of these maps. They would become one of the 20 sources he used to create his own masterpiece. When his uncle Kemal Reis died in 1511, killed when his ship sank during a storm, Piri temporarily retired from active sea duty and settled in Gallipoli. There, in the quiet between voyages, he began his great work. He gathered his collection of maps and charts, spreading them out, comparing them, trying to synthesize them into a single unified vision of the world. It must have been an enormous undertaking. He had Greek maps, supposedly from the time of Alexander the Great, showing the Mediterranean world as the ancients knew it. Portuguese maps showing recent discoveries along the African coast and in Brazil, places the Portuguese were keeping secret from their rivals. Arabic maps of the Indian Ocean accumulated from centuries of Muslim trade networks. And those precious Columbus charts showing the New World, islands and coastlines, Europeans had only just begun to understand. The map he created was finished in 1513, in the Islamic year 919. It was drawn on gazelle parchment, which was expensive but durable, colored with natural dyes and covered with detailed notations in Ottoman Turkish. Piri didn't just copy his sources blindly. He analyzed them, compared them, tried to reconcile conflicting information. When sources disagreed, he made judgment calls. He added his own observations and commentary, little notes about what he thought was reliable and what wasn't. The result was not just a map, but a kind of geographic encyclopedia, a synthesis of everything the 16th century world knew about the shape of the Earth. After completing his map, Piri returned to naval service. He participated in the Ottoman conquest of Egypt in 1517, commanding vessels in the Red Sea, helping secure Ottoman control over one of the richest provinces in the Mediterranean world. After the victory, he presented his map to Sultan Selim I. It's not clear what the Sultan thought of it, or whether he ever used it for navigation or military planning. The historical record is silent on that. What is clear is that the map was valued enough to be preserved in the royal archives, carefully stored away, where it remained for over 400 years, forgotten by the world outside the palace walls. Piri Reis himself went on to have a distinguished, if ultimately tragic, career. He became an admiral, commanded fleets in the Indian Ocean, fought against the Portuguese for control of trade routes, and wrote a famous book on Mediterranean navigation called the Kitab Bahriye, the Book of Maritime Matters. It's an extraordinary work, that book. Over 200 detailed charts of Mediterranean coastlines, descriptions of safe harbors and dangerous reefs, notes on winds and currents. It became the standard navigation guide for Ottoman sailors for generations. But in 1554, at the age of nearly 90, imagine being an active admiral at 90. Piri Reis was executed. The charges were military. Something about lifting a siege too early, depriving the Sultan of victory, though the politics were probably more complicated than that. You don't execute a 90-year-old war hero over a single tactical decision unless there's more going on beneath the surface. His head was displayed in Istanbul as a warning, but his maps survived him. When Gustav Deismann found the fragment in 1929, only about 1/3 of the original map still existed. The rest had been lost, perhaps destroyed in one of the fires that periodically swept through the palace, perhaps simply discarded as the empire declined, and old documents were deemed worthless parchment that could be recycled or burned for heat. What survived was enough to show the Atlantic Ocean, the coasts of Europe and Africa in reasonable detail, the eastern edge of South America, with remarkable accuracy for the time, and that mysterious southern landmass, that problematic, controversial, endlessly debated strip of land at the bottom of the map. The discovery created immediate excitement in academic circles. Here was a 16th century map that incorporated Columbus's own work. Here was evidence of how rapidly geographic knowledge was spreading in the years after 1492. Scholars could read Piri's notes, could trace his sources to some extent, could verify that, yes, this was a genuine document from 1513. But they struggled to explain some of its features. The accuracy of the South American coastline was remarkable for its time. Places like Rio de Janeiro and the mouth of the Amazon were depicted with surprising precision, considering European explorers had only been in the region for about 20 years when Piri drew his map. The mathematical sophistication suggested knowledge of projection techniques that European cartographers supposedly hadn't developed yet. And then there was that southern coast. That was the real problem. By the 1960s, a professor named Charles Hapgood became fascinated by the map. Hapgood taught at Keene State College in New Hampshire, a small school, but he had big ideas. He enlisted his students in a detailed analysis of the Piri Reis Map, having them measure angles, compare coastlines, overlay the ancient map onto modern projections. What they found surprised them. When they carefully overlaid the map's southern coastline with modern maps of Antarctica, specifically the Queen Maud Land region, the features seemed to match. Not perfectly, no, but well enough to be striking. Mountains where mountains should be, beneath the ice. Bays where bays existed in the subglacial topography. Rivers flowing from highland regions to coastal areas, exactly as they would have flowed if Antarctica weren't frozen. Hapgood published his findings in 1966 in a book called Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. In it, he argued that the Piri Reis Map and other anomalous charts showed evidence of an advanced ancient civilization that had mapped the world during a time when Antarctica was ice-free. He suggested that these ancient maps had been copied and recopied through the ages, passed down through various cultures, Phoenicians, Greeks, Arabs, until they eventually ended up in the hands of medieval map makers like Piri Reis. Map makers who didn't fully understand what they were copying, but preserved the information nonetheless. The theory was, and remains, highly controversial. Most historians and geologists reject it outright. They point out that Antarctica has been ice-covered for 34 million years, far longer than modern humans have existed. They argue that the supposed matches between the Piri Reis Map and Antarctic features are coincidental, or the result of wishful thinking, or based on distorted comparisons that require rotating and stretching the map in unrealistic ways. But the debate hasn't ended. Every few years, someone rediscovers the Piri Reis Map, looks at that southern coastline with fresh eyes, and asks the same questions all over again. How did Piri know about coastlines that wouldn't be discovered for centuries? Where did his source maps come from? And if that really is Antarctica at the bottom of his map, if that's even remotely possible, what does it mean? Let's look closer at what the map actually shows. When you look at the southern portion of the Piri Reis Map, what you see depends a lot on what you're looking for. To some researchers, it's clearly just an extension of South America, the coast continuing further south than it actually does, distorted by the limitations of 16th century cartography and the challenges of working from incomplete sources. To others, it's something else entirely. A glimpse of a continent that shouldn't be there. The coastline is detailed, that much is undeniable. It shows mountains depicted in the traditional style of the period, with small triangular peaks lined up like teeth. It shows what appear to be rivers flowing from inland regions down to the coast. There are bays, inlets, geographic features that suggest someone was trying to represent a real place, not just filling in blank space with imagination or guesswork. Piri Reis himself didn't leave notes specifically identifying this region as Antarctica. He couldn't have. The name Antarctica didn't exist in 1513. The word itself comes from the Greek Antarktikos, meaning opposite to the Arctic. But it wasn't applied to the southern polar region until much later. The concept of a southern continent was theoretical in Piri's time, based on ancient Greek ideas about the world needing a large landmass in the south to balance the known continents in the north. The Greeks called it Terra Australis, the southern land, and they imagined it extending all the way up to the middle latitudes, a vast unknown territory that balanced the world like a counterweight. What makes the Piri Reis depiction interesting is that it doesn't look like the imaginary Terra Australis of medieval fantasy maps. Those maps showed vast, exaggerated continents, often populated with monsters and mythical creatures, sea serpents and dog-headed men. The southern coastline on the Piri Reis map is measured, specific, detailed in a way that suggests real geographic knowledge rather than pure speculation. In 1960, a U.S. Air Force officer named Captain Lorenzo W. Burroughs examined the map. Burroughs had expertise in cartography and photographic intelligence. skills honed during World War II and the Cold War, when accurate maps meant everything. He wrote to Professor Charles Hapgood, saying that, in his opinion, the Piri Reis Map showed striking similarities to the actual coastline of Antarctica, specifically the Queen Maud Land region. He noted that the mountains depicted on the map corresponded to actual Antarctic mountain ranges, and that the coastline details matched, features that had only been discovered through modern seismic surveys that could see through the ice, mapping the bedrock topography beneath. The U.S. Air Force's 8th Reconnaissance Technical Squadron even issued a formal letter stating that the Piri Reis Map appeared to show Antarctica's coastline as it would look without its ice cap, and that the level of detail suggested the original source maps must have been compiled when the land was relatively ice-free. This was a stunning claim, coming from military cartographic experts who had no particular interest in promoting fringe theories. But how reliable are these comparisons? That's where things get murky, where the certainty starts to dissolve. To make the Piri Reis coastline match Antarctica, you have to adjust for projection differences. The Piri Reis Map uses what's called a portolan projection, a method used by medieval navigators that shows compass directions radiating from various points. It's great for plotting courses, between ports for figuring out which direction to sail. But it distorts distances and shapes in specific ways, especially at higher latitudes. Modern maps of Antarctica use different projections, polar projections that try to accurately represent the circular arrangement of land around the South Pole. To compare the Piri Reis map with modern Antarctic maps, you need to convert between projection systems, and that conversion introduces uncertainty. Small adjustments in how you do the conversion can make features appear to match, or not match. Critics point out that Hapgood and others cherry-picked the features that seem to match while ignoring the many discrepancies. For example, the scale is off. The landmass on the Piri Reis map is much larger than Antarctica's actual Queen Maud Land coast. To make things fit, you have to scale it down significantly. The orientation is wrong too. To make things line up, Hapgood had to rotate the map by about 20 degrees. And there are features on the Piri Reis map that don't correspond to anything in Antarctica, while Antarctica has major features, like the Antarctic Peninsula, the most prominent geographic feature on the continent, that aren't on the Piri Reis map at all. The most damning criticism is probably the simplest one. If you just assume the southern coast on the Piri Reis map is a distorted version of South America's coast, specifically the Patagonian region and maybe the Falkland Islands, everything makes sense without requiring any impossible explanations. Piri had access to Portuguese maps of this area. Portuguese explorers had been sailing down the South American coast in the early 1500s, pushing further south with each voyage, looking for a passage to the Pacific. They might have reached further south than official records show. Their maps, copied by Piri, could have been inaccurate, exaggerated, or confused. When Piri tried to synthesize multiple imperfect sources, he might have created a coastline that extended too far south, that combined features from different regions in odd ways. That would explain everything without requiring ancient ice-free Antarctic maps or lost civilizations or impossible voyages to the bottom of the world. And yet, there are those details. The rivers flowing from mountains to coast, placed exactly where they would be if you were looking at Queen Maud Land. The specific arrangement of bays and inlets, The fact that when modern researchers used seismic data in the 1960s to map Antarctica's bedrock topography beneath miles of ice, work that was done for purely scientific reasons with no thought to ancient maps. Some of the features lined up with what Piri Reis had drawn 500 years earlier. Maybe it's coincidence. Maybe the human tendency to find patterns, to connect dots that shouldn't be connected, is leading us astray. Our brains are so good at this. Too good, perhaps. We see faces on Mars, hidden messages in beetles, songs played backward, significance in random noise. Or maybe, just maybe, there's something more to this. Something that suggests the Piri Reis Map was based on older sources. Sources that showed a world we've forgotten. Knowledge that has somehow survived the long journey through time, even as its origins have been lost. One of the most intriguing aspects of the map is its mathematical sophistication. Portolan charts, the type of navigation map common in the medieval Mediterranean, typically showed compass directions, but weren't concerned with representing the Earth as a sphere. They were practical tools for sailing from port to port, not attempts to capture the true shape of the world. But the Piri Reis Map shows evidence of more advanced techniques. Some researchers have noted that the map appears to use a projection method similar to the one later developed by Gerardus Mercator in 1569, more than 50 years after Piri drew his map. The Mercator projection was revolutionary. It allowed sailors to plot straight-line courses across the ocean, maintaining constant compass bearings. It required sophisticated mathematical understanding of how to represent a sphere on a flat surface, how to deal with the fact that longitude lines converge at the poles while latitude lines remain parallel. If Piri Reis was using a similar projection in 1513, where did he learn it? The answer might be straightforward. The ancient Greeks knew the Earth was round. Eratosthenes calculated its circumference around 240 BCE with remarkable accuracy. Greek scholars developed methods for calculating latitude and longitude. They understood spherical geometry. Piri Reis claimed to have used Greek maps from the time of Alexander the Great, maps based on Ptolemy's work. Maybe those maps contained mathematical knowledge that later got lost in Europe during the Middle Ages, but survived in the Islamic world, where Greek learning was preserved, translated, and built upon. When Piri compiled his map, he might have been recovering knowledge that had been mainstream in antiquity but forgotten in medieval Europe. That explanation makes sense. It's satisfying. It doesn't require anything impossible. And yet, it still leaves us with questions. Because if the Greeks could make maps this sophisticated, why don't we have more examples of them? Why did this knowledge have to be recovered piecemeal from scattered sources? What happened to all those other maps that Piri mentions using? The truth is, we don't know. We can't know. We're looking at a fragment, 1/3 of an original map, compiled from sources that are themselves lost, trying to puzzle out what it shows and what it means. We're seeing shadows of knowledge, echoes of exploration, hints of a world that was perhaps better mapped than we realize. And the Piri Reis Map isn't alone in this. There are other maps, other fragments from other times that show similar anomalies. Let's look at them next. The Piri Reis Map might be the most famous, but it's not the only ancient map that appears to show impossible knowledge. There's a pattern here, if you look for it. A recurring theme of maps that depict lands and coastlines that shouldn't be accurately known yet, drawn by cartographers who by all rights shouldn't have had access to this information. Let me tell you about another map, drawn just 18 years after Piri Reis created his. In 1531, a French mathematician and cartographer named Aurence Finet published a world map that showed something remarkable. At the bottom, centered on the South Pole, Finet drew a large continent. He labeled it Terra Australis, the southern land. And here's what's striking. The continent he drew bears an uncanny resemblance to Antarctica's actual shape. Finet's map, known as the Orontius Phineus map, using the Latinized version of his name, shows Antarctica as a heart-shaped landmass with a narrower western section and a broader eastern section. It shows mountain ranges in the interior. It shows rivers flowing from those mountains to the coast, dozens of them, like arteries leading to the sea. It shows the continent at approximately the correct size and in approximately the correct position. Now, remember, this is 1531. Antarctica wouldn't be officially sighted for another 289 years. Cook wouldn't cross the Antarctic Circle until 1773. Bellingshausen and Lazarev wouldn't confirm a continent existed there until 1820. Yet here's Aurence Finet drawing it with what some researchers call remarkable accuracy. Charles Hapgood studied this map extensively and claimed it was one of the strongest pieces of evidence for ancient Antarctic exploration. He argued that Finet must have been working from older source maps, just like Piri Reis, and that those source maps showed Antarctica from a time before it was fully glaciated. He pointed out that the shape is right. East Antarctica, the larger portion, is on one side. West Antarctica, smaller and more mountainous, is on the other. The Ross Sea and the Weddell Sea, the two great indentations in Antarctica's coastline, appear in approximately the right places. The skeptical explanation is similar to the one for the Piri Reis map. Aurence Finet was working in an age when cartographers regularly speculated about the existence of southern continents. The ancient Greeks had theorized that there must be a large landmass in the southern hemisphere to balance the known northern continents. Medieval and Renaissance cartographers took this idea and ran with it, drawing imaginary southern continents of various shapes and sizes on their maps. It was considered intellectually sophisticated to include Terra Australis. It showed you understood classical learning, that you were familiar with Ptolemy and the Greek geographers. Maybe Finet's map just happens to look like Antarctica by coincidence. Maybe he was making educated guesses based on limited exploration data and theoretical geography. Maybe we're seeing patterns that aren't really there, finding significance in what's actually just lucky guessing. But then there's the Philippe Boiche map, drawn in 1737. This one's different. This one shows something that shouldn't be possible. Boiche was a French geographer, a serious scholar, someone who approached cartography with scientific rigor. He was appointed royal geographer to the King of France. He developed new theories about how mountain ranges and ocean basins were structured. He wasn't a mystical thinker or a promoter of wild theories. His map of the southern regions shows something extraordinary. It depicts Antarctica as two separate land masses, divided by a channel of water running across the continent. Here's why that's significant, why it makes even skeptics pause. When modern scientists used seismic surveys to map Antarctica's bedrock topography beneath the ice, work that wasn't done until the 1950s during the International Geophysical Year, they discovered that Antarctica is, indeed, two land masses underneath all that ice: West Antarctica and East Antarctica. They're connected by a land bridge, but if you remove the ice and adjust it for isostatic rebound, the way land rises when the weight of ice is removed, they would be separated by a channel of water, possibly even a strait. Boache couldn't have known this through direct observation. The ice was there in 1737, thousands of feet thick, just as it is today. Seismic surveying didn't exist. Ground-penetrating radar didn't exist. Satellite imaging didn't exist. Yet his map shows the division. Boache himself explained his map by saying he was extrapolating from reports of icebergs and from theoretical geography. He believed ocean currents and the distribution of icebergs suggested the presence of land at the South Pole, and he tried to deduce what that land might look like. He noted that icebergs in the Southern Ocean seemed to come from two different source regions, suggesting two separate ice masses, which might mean two separate land masses. It's possible his correct depiction of Antarctica's two-part structure was an educated guess that happened to be right. Sometimes smart people making informed deductions get lucky. Or it's possible he had access to older maps, now lost, that preserved geographic knowledge from a time when Antarctica could actually be surveyed, when the ice cover was less complete, when the division between East and West was visible. That's the claim that keeps coming up, this idea of ancient source maps being copied through the centuries, their information preserved even as their origins were forgotten, like a game of telephone played across millennia where the message somehow survived intact. There's another map worth mentioning, though it's less well known than the others. In 1559, a Turkish admiral named Haji Ahmed drew a world map that shows both polar regions. His depiction of the Arctic is surprisingly accurate, showing Greenland and the islands of northern Canada with reasonable precision. But it's his Antarctic depiction that's interesting for our purposes. He shows a southern continent with detailed coastlines, mountain ranges, and geographic features that, again, seem to match Antarctica's actual topography when you account for projection differences. These maps span decades and cross cultural boundaries. You have Turkish admirals, French mathematicians, cartographers from different backgrounds and different times, all apparently working from similar source material or arriving at similar conclusions. If they were all just making things up, filling in blank spaces with pure imagination, why would their inventions look similar? Why would they all happen to guess that Antarctica exists and happen to draw it with features that vaguely correspond to reality? The conventional answer is that they were all drawing on the same theoretical tradition. The idea of Terra Australis, the great southern continent, was common in educated circles throughout Europe and the Islamic world. Map makers copied from each other. When one person drew a southern continent a certain way, others followed suit, either directly copying or working from similar assumptions. The similarities between these maps aren't evidence of ancient knowledge, but evidence of a shared cultural imagination, a kind of consensus fantasy about what must exist at the bottom of the world. That makes sense. That's probably the right explanation. And yet there are those details that don't quite fit. The mountains in the right places, the rivers flowing correctly, the two-part structure of the Boache map matching the actual subglacial geography, the mathematical sophistication of the projections suggesting knowledge that seems ahead of its time. Little things that keep nagging, keep suggesting that maybe, possibly, there's something we're missing. Let's consider another angle. What if we're asking the wrong question entirely? What if the question isn't, did ancient civilizations map Antarctica? But rather, when was Antarctica last ice-free enough to be mapped? According to mainstream geology, Antarctica has been essentially ice-covered for about 34 million years. The ice sheet started forming at the Eocene-Oligocene boundary when global temperatures dropped and the Antarctic circumpolar current developed, isolating the continent from warmer ocean waters. Once the ice started forming, positive feedback mechanisms kept it there. Ice reflects sunlight, keeping temperatures low, which preserves the ice, which reflects more sunlight. The ice sheet has grown and shrunk over millions of years as climate has varied, but it's never completely disappeared since it first formed. If that's true, if Antarctica has been ice-covered for 34 million years, then there's no way ancient humans could have mapped it without ice. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, only evolved about 300,000 years ago. Civilization, agriculture, cities, writing, all of that is less than 10,000 years old. We missed Antarctica's ice-free period by tens of millions of years, unless the timeline is wrong. Unless Antarctica was ice-free more recently than we think, or unless the ice coverage was less complete than we assume, leaving some coastal areas accessible. That's what some alternative researchers argue, that perhaps during the last ice age, when global sea levels were much lower because so much water was locked up in ice sheets covering North America and Europe, Antarctica's coasts were more exposed, more accessible than they are today. It's a stretch, though. It requires ancient civilizations to have had ocean-going vessels capable of reaching Antarctica through some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. It requires them to have had navigation skills sophisticated enough to find it. It requires those civilizations to have left no other trace of their existence except these maps. That's a lot of requirements. A lot of things that have to be true for this explanation to work. Maybe it's simpler. Maybe these maps don't show Antarctica at all. Maybe they show South America, distorted and misunderstood. Maybe they show theoretical geography, educated guesses that happen to be partially correct through pure chance. Maybe we're looking for mystery, where there's only the normal confusion and error of early cartography, the inevitable mistakes that happen when people try to map a world they haven't fully explored. But if that's the case, if these maps are just mistakes and speculation, then why do they keep appearing? Why do different cartographers, separated by time and culture, keep drawing similar southern continents with similar features? Why does the Boache map show Antarctica divided into two parts when that fact wasn't scientifically established until seismic surveys in the 1950s proved it? Perhaps the answer lies not in Antarctica itself, but in who might have explored it. What civilizations might have been capable of such voyages? Let's explore that possibility next. If we're going to seriously consider the possibility that Antarctica was mapped in ancient times, we need to ask a fundamental question. Who could have done it? What civilizations had the maritime technology, the motivation, and the geographic knowledge to attempt such a voyage? What culture possessed ships capable of surviving the Southern Ocean, arguably the most dangerous waters on Earth? Let's start with the ones we know about, the ones history remembers. The Phoenicians were perhaps the ancient world's greatest seafarers. Operating out of what's now Lebanon, They established colonies and trading posts across the entire Mediterranean. They ventured out through the Straits of Gibraltar into the Atlantic, a journey that terrified many ancient peoples who saw the Mediterranean as the known world and everything beyond as the realm of monsters. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, around 600 BCE, the Phoenicians were hired by Egyptian pharaoh Necho II to circumnavigate Africa. They supposedly sailed south down the Red Sea, around the Cape of Good Hope, and returned through the Mediterranean 3 years later. If that account is true, and many historians believe it is, it means the Phoenicians rounded the southern tip of Africa more than 2,000 years before Vasco da Gama did the same thing in 1497. If anyone in the ancient world had the skills to explore far southern waters, it would have been the Phoenicians. They had sturdy ships. They understood celestial navigation. They weren't afraid of open ocean. But there's no evidence they went anywhere near Antarctica. The circumnavigation of Africa, if it happened, was already an extraordinary achievement for its time. The waters around the Cape of Good Hope are treacherous enough. Pushing further south into the Antarctic convergence, battling icebergs and storms that dwarf anything in the Mediterranean, would have been beyond even their considerable abilities. And more importantly, they had no reason to. The Phoenicians were traders, practical people. They went where profit called them. They established colonies where they could trade for tin, copper, amber, purple dye. There was nothing in the frozen south to trade for. No resources, no markets, no reason to risk valuable ships and experienced sailors. The Polynesians are another candidate, and perhaps a more intriguing one. These remarkable navigators settled every habitable island in the Pacific Ocean, traveling thousands of miles in outrigger canoes, navigating by stars, wave patterns, cloud formations, and the flight patterns of birds. They reached Hawaii, Easter Island, New Zealand, islands separated by vast stretches of open ocean that European sailors with compasses and maps found daunting. They reached New Zealand, which isn't far from Antarctica, relatively speaking. New Zealand sits at about 40 degrees south latitude. Antarctica begins at about 60 degrees south. It's only about 1,500 miles from the southern tip of New Zealand to the northern edge of the Antarctic continent. Could the Polynesians have pushed further south? The Maori, the Polynesian people who settled New Zealand around 1300 CE, have legends that some researchers interpret as references to voyages to a frozen land far to the south. Stories about mountains of ice, about lands where it was always cold, about journeys to the edge of the world. But there's no solid evidence of Antarctic exploration in Polynesian culture. No clear traditions of reaching the ice. No preserved knowledge of southern coastlines. And while Polynesian navigation was sophisticated, their vessels weren't designed for polar conditions. Outrigger canoes are magnificent craft, perfectly adapted for tropical and temperate Pacific waters. But icebergs would have been deadly. Freezing temperatures would have killed people who had evolved for warm climates and who traveled with minimal clothing and supplies. Could a few Polynesian voyagers have been blown south by storms, glimpsed Antarctica through the mist, and returned to tell the tale? Perhaps. It's not impossible. But mapping it, recording detailed coastlines, that seems unlikely. Then there are the civilizations we don't know as much about. The ones that might have existed before recorded history, in the Neolithic period or earlier. the hypothetical cultures that left no written records or whose records have been lost. This is where the discussion gets more speculative, where we move from documented history into educated guessing and controversial theories. Graham Hancock, in his book Fingerprints of the Gods, proposed that there was an advanced civilization during the last ice age before 12,000 years ago. This civilization, he argued, had global reach, sophisticated knowledge of mathematics and astronomy, and seafaring capabilities we don't associate with the Ice Age. When the Ice Age ended catastrophically, when massive floods reshaped coastlines and sea levels rose by hundreds of feet, this civilization was destroyed. But fragments of their knowledge survived, preserved in myths, monuments, and perhaps in maps that were copied and recopied through the millennia. Hancock points to various anomalies that might support this theory. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, built around 9600 BCE, shows architectural sophistication that wasn't supposed to exist yet. Massive stone pillars arranged in circles, carved with intricate reliefs of animals. It predates pottery, metallurgy, and permanent agricultural settlements. Who built it? How did hunter-gatherers organize the labor? The precision of the Great Pyramids in Egypt suggests mathematical knowledge that seems remarkably advanced for the Bronze Age. The alignment with cardinal directions, the use of the golden ratio, the astronomical correlations. Could these represent recovered knowledge from an earlier time? Legends from around the world speak of wise teachers who brought knowledge of agriculture, astronomy, and architecture to primitive peoples after a great catastrophe. The Sumerians spoke of the Apkallu, 7 sages who taught civilization. The Egyptians remembered Thoth. The Mesoamericans revered Quetzalcoatl. The Hindus had their rishis. Different names, but similar stories. Bearded men arriving from across the sea, bringing knowledge, establishing the foundations of civilization, then departing. Could such a lost civilization have mapped Antarctica? In theory, yes. If they existed. If they had the technology. If they were operating during a slightly warmer period when ice coverage was reduced, or during a time when they had developed means of navigation, we can't imagine. When their civilization collapsed in the cataclysms at the end of the Ice Age, their maps might have been preserved by the cultures that came after them, copied and recopied until they eventually reached medieval cartographers like Piri Reis and Fine. The problem with this theory is the complete lack of physical evidence. We haven't found ruins of this advanced Ice Age civilization. We haven't found their tools, their pottery, their art, their cities. If they were sophisticated enough to build ocean-going vessels and create accurate maps requiring extensive exploration, they were sophisticated enough to leave other traces. Where are those traces? Hancock's response is that we haven't looked in the right places. If this civilization was coastal, centered on seafaring and maritime trade, their cities would have been built near the ocean at whatever the sea level was 12,000 or 15,000 years ago. When sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age, rising by more than 400 feet in some regions, those coastal cities would have been drowned. They're now underwater on continental shelves, buried under sediment and millennia of marine deposits. We wouldn't find them unless we specifically searched the ocean floor for submerged ruins. And we're only just beginning to map the ocean floor in detail to survey continental shelves for archaeological sites that might date to periods of lower sea level. There have been some intriguing discoveries. Structures off the coast of Japan, near Yonaguni, that might be carved stone platforms or might be natural rock formations. Anomalies in sonar surveys off the western coast of India. Strange formations near Cuba that some researchers interpret as submerged buildings. None of it proven. All of it controversial. But enough to keep the speculation alive. Enough to suggest that maybe, possibly, there's more to discover beneath the waves. There's another possibility we should consider, one that requires less from any single civilization. What if no single culture mapped Antarctica? What if the knowledge was cumulative, built up gradually over thousands of years by different peoples that pushed incrementally further south, each expedition adding a little more detail to the collective understanding? Imagine ancient seafarers, perhaps 10,000 or 12,000 years ago, during the Younger Dryas period when the climate was unstable and strange. They're blown off course during a storm, pushed far to the south by winds and currents they couldn't control. They encounter ice, frozen lands, coastlines unlike anything they've seen before. Most of them probably don't survive the journey. The cold, the storms, the sheer distance from home. It would have been almost impossible to return. But a few make it back, and they tell stories. They draw rough maps, crude sketches of what they saw. Those maps get copied, refined, combined with other explorers' accounts from other voyages. Over centuries, over millennia, a composite picture emerges. No single voyage mapped Antarctica completely. But the accumulated knowledge of many voyages, many near disasters, many accidental discoveries, preserved in maps that were copied and recopied, eventually captured the continent's basic shape. It's a scenario that requires less from any individual civilization. It doesn't need an advanced Ice Age superculture with impossible technology. It just needs persistent human curiosity, the courage to explore beyond known boundaries, and the inevitable accidents that sometimes push explorers further than they intended to go. But even this scenario has problems. It requires maritime activity on a large enough scale that multiple expeditions reached Antarctic waters over an extended period. It requires those expeditions to have survived and returned with information intact. It requires their maps to have been preserved and passed down through multiple civilizations, multiple languages, multiple cultural upheavals over thousands of years. It's possible. But it's a lot of things that have to align just right. Maybe we're overthinking this entirely. Maybe the answer is much simpler. Maybe the ancient Greeks, with their knowledge of mathematics and astronomy, figured out that there must be a southern continent based on purely theoretical grounds. Maybe they made educated guesses about what it would look like. Guesses based on symmetry, on the idea that the Earth needed balance, on geometric principles. Maybe those guesses, preserved in now lost texts and maps, were more accurate than we give them credit for. Maybe medieval cartographers like Piri Reis and Oronce Fine weren't copying maps of actual exploration, but rather copying theoretical geography that happened, by chance, to be surprisingly close to reality. That explanation doesn't require lost civilizations or ice-free Antarctica or ancient expeditions to the South Pole. It just requires smart people making informed deductions. And sometimes, smart people guess right. Occam's razor suggests that's probably the correct answer. The simplest explanation that fits the facts is usually right. And yet those rivers on the Piri Reis Map keep flowing in just the right places. The two-part structure on the Boachi map keeps matching the actual Subglacial geography. The mathematical sophistication keeps seeming ahead of its time. These details keep pulling us back into speculation, into wondering if maybe, possibly, there's something we're missing. Perhaps the answer lies not in who mapped Antarctica, but in how they might have navigated there. What techniques could ancient mariners have used to reach such remote waters, to survive such a journey, to find their way home again? Let's explore that next. Every culture has its flood myths. The similarities are striking, almost eerie. From Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, from India to the Pacific Islands, stories of a great deluge that destroyed the world. Waters rising, covering the land, drowning civilizations. A chosen few surviving in boats, preserving knowledge, beginning again. The biblical story of Noah is probably the most familiar to Western audiences. But it's just one version of a much older, much more widespread narrative. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written in ancient Sumeria, thousands of years before Genesis, tells of Utnapishtim, who survived a flood by building a great boat. The Hindu tradition speaks of Manu, warned by a fish to construct a vessel before the waters came. Greek mythology remembers Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha, surviving when Zeus flooded the world to punish humanity's corruption. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia have flood stories. The Maori of New Zealand remember when the seas rose. Native American tribes across both continents preserved tales of the world drowning. Why is this story so universal? The conventional explanation is that floods are common, that most ancient peoples lived near rivers or coasts, and that catastrophic flooding would have been a recurring threat. Local floods got magnified in cultural memory, transformed into cosmic events, mythologized into stories about the whole world being submerged. That makes sense for most of these stories. Rivers flood. Tsunamis strike coastal communities. These are traumatic events that would naturally be preserved in myth and legend. But at the end of the last ice age, around 11,000 to 12,000 years ago, something happened that went beyond local flooding. Global sea levels rose by more than 400 feet over several thousand years as the great ice sheets covering North America and Europe melted. Coastlines were redrawn, entire landscapes were submerged, islands vanished. What had been fertile plains became ocean floor, if there were civilizations living along those coasts. And why wouldn't there be? Coasts are prime real estate for fishing and trade. They would have been forced to retreat, to move to higher ground, to abandon everything they'd built near the sea. And they would remember. Cultures would preserve the memory of lands lost beneath the waves, of cities swallowed by the rising waters, of a time when the world was different, when you could walk where now there's only ocean. Perhaps that's what these flood myths really are. Not memories of local disasters, but fragmentary cultural recollections of the great sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age. Distorted by time, transformed into divine punishment or cosmic catastrophe, but rooted in real events. If that's true, if these myths preserve memories from 12,000 years ago, what else might they preserve? There are other recurring themes in global mythology that might hint at lost knowledge. The Atlantis story is probably the most famous. Plato wrote about it in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, describing an advanced island civilization that existed 9,000 years before his time. According to Plato, Atlantis was a naval power, controlling much of the Mediterranean and Atlantic. But the Atlanteans became corrupt and the gods destroyed them in a single day and night of catastrophe, sinking their island beneath the waves. Most scholars consider this a moral fable Plato invented to make philosophical points about ideal societies and the dangers of hubris. There's no archaeological evidence for a literal Atlantis. The geography Plato describes, beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean, doesn't match any known ancient civilization. But the story has resonated for centuries. Why? Perhaps because it taps into something deeper, some cultural memory of civilizations that really were lost. Perhaps not in the Atlantic, but elsewhere. Perhaps not sunk in a day, but gradually submerged as sea levels rose. Other legends speak of wise teachers bringing knowledge to primitive peoples. The Sumerians remembered the Apkallu, 7 sages who emerged from the sea before the flood, teaching humanity the arts of civilization. Egyptian traditions spoke of Thoth, god of wisdom and writing, who recorded all knowledge. In Mesoamerica, multiple cultures revered Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, described as a bearded man from across the sea who taught agriculture, astronomy, and architecture before departing with promises to return. Similar figures appear in Andean mythology as Viracocha, in Hindu tradition as the Rishis. Different names, different details, but a common pattern. Civilizing heroes appearing from elsewhere, often from across water, bringing knowledge, establishing the foundations of culture, then departing. Could these stories preserve memories of contact with a more advanced culture? Perhaps not aliens or gods, but other human societies, technologically superior, who traveled widely and shared knowledge before being destroyed by the climate changes at the end of the Ice Age. It's speculative, highly speculative, but it's not impossible. What about Antarctica specifically? Are there any legends that might refer to a southern polar land? This is where things get interesting, where the trail becomes very faint but intriguing. The Maori of New Zealand have stories of voyages south to a land of ice. They're ambiguous, could refer to the southern tip of New Zealand itself, which can get quite cold and even has a few small glaciers. But some researchers interpret these stories as references to Antarctica. There's a Maori legend about a chief named Ui Te Rangiora, who sailed far to the south in a great canoe around 650 CE. According to the legend, he reached a place where the sea was frozen, where icebergs rose like mountains, where it was always cold. He returned to tell of this strange land at the edge of the world. Is this Antarctica? Or just poetic description of stormy southern waters and icebergs that drift north from the Antarctic continent? We can't know for certain. The ancient Greeks didn't have specific legends about Antarctica because they didn't know it existed in any literal sense. But they did have theories. They believed in symmetry, in balance. The northern hemisphere had large land masses. Logic suggested the southern hemisphere should have equally large land to balance the world. Aristotle wrote about this. He called the hypothetical southern continent the Antarctic zone, meaning opposite the Arctic. The name stuck, even though the Greeks never saw the actual continent. But here's something curious. Some ancient Greek texts hint at knowledge of southern lands that goes beyond pure theory. Ptolemy, the great geographer whose work influenced map-making for 1,500 years, described a large southern continent connecting Africa and Asia. He called it Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. His maps showed it extending far north of where Antarctica actually lies, blocking off the Indian Ocean in a massive arc. Where did Ptolemy get this idea? Was it pure speculation based on his theory that the world needed balance? Or was he working from earlier sources, now lost, that described actual exploration of southern waters? We don't know. Ptolemy's maps were drawn in the 2nd century CE. The sources he used were older still, some possibly dating back centuries. The chain of information transmission is so long, so fragmented, that we can't trace it back to any original source. But the fact remains that ancient geographers were confident there was a large landmass in the southern hemisphere. They weren't uncertain about this. They stated it as fact. Maybe they were lucky guessers. Maybe they reasoned it out from first principles and happened to be right. Or maybe, somewhere in the tangled web of ancient navigation lore and forgotten exploration accounts, there was real knowledge of southern lands. Knowledge that got mixed with theory and speculation, but preserved enough truth to influence mapmakers 2,000 years later. There's one more set of legends worth mentioning, though they're controversial and many scholars dismiss them outright. Stories from various indigenous peoples about ancient contacts with voyagers from other lands. Oral traditions that speak of boats arriving from across the ocean, of strangers with different appearances and technologies, of knowledge being shared. These stories exist, but interpreting them is difficult. Are they memories of real historical contacts? Are they mythological explanations for where knowledge came from? Are they later inventions influenced by European colonization? It's hard to say. Oral traditions are fluid. They change over time, incorporate new elements, reinterpret old stories in light of new experiences. But if we allow ourselves to speculate, if we entertain the possibility that there might be grains of historical truth in these legends, then perhaps they hint at a world more connected than we realize. Perhaps ancient mariners did travel further, share knowledge more widely, explore more extensively than the written record suggests. And perhaps some of that exploration reached the southern limits of the world, to the edge of the ice, to the frozen continent that wouldn't be officially discovered until the 19th century. It's a romantic notion, an intriguing possibility. But without solid evidence, it remains just that. A possibility, not a proven fact. What we need to understand next is the climate itself. How has Antarctica's ice cover changed over time? When was it last warm enough for significant coastal areas to be ice-free? Let's look at the science of ice ages and what they might tell us about Antarctica's accessibility. The Earth's climate is not constant. It shifts, cycles, fluctuates over timescales, ranging from decades to millions of years. We're living in an ice age right now. That might surprise you. When you think ice age, you probably imagine woolly mammoths and vast glaciers covering half of North America. But those were just the coldest periods within a longer ice age that we're still in. Scientists call these cold periods glacials, and the warmer periods in between interglacials. Right now, we're in an interglacial period called the Holocene, which began about 11,700 years ago when the last glacial period ended. During that last glacial maximum, about 20,000 years ago, ice sheets covered Canada, northern Europe, parts of Asia. Sea levels were 400 feet lower than today because so much water was locked up in ice. You could walk from France to England. Indonesia was connected to mainland Asia. there were vast coastal plains that are now underwater. But here's what's important for our story. Antarctica was already frozen. In fact, Antarctica has been continuously ice-covered for about 34 million years, long before the current ice age even began. So if Antarctica has been frozen for 34 million years, how could anyone have mapped it without ice? This is the central problem with theories about ancient Antarctic exploration. Unless the timeline is wrong. Unless Antarctica wasn't as completely ice-covered as we think during certain periods. Unless there were windows of opportunity when coastal areas were accessible. Let's look at what the science actually says. The Antarctic ice sheet began forming around 34 million years ago during a period called the Eocene-Oligocene boundary. Global temperatures dropped, carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere decreased, and critically, the Antarctic circumpolar current developed. This ocean current flows around Antarctica from west to east, driven by the powerful westerly winds of the southern latitudes. It acts like a wall, isolating Antarctica from warmer ocean currents that flow in from the north. Cold water circulates around the continent, keeping temperatures low, preserving the ice sheet. Once the ice started forming, positive feedback mechanisms kicked in. Ice is white, so it reflects sunlight back into space instead of absorbing heat. This keeps the continent cold. The cold preserves the ice. The ice reflects more sunlight. The cycle reinforces itself. Over millions of years, the ice has grown and shrunk slightly in response to global climate changes, but it has never completely disappeared. Even during warm periods, when there was no ice at the North Pole, Antarctica remained frozen. The ice cores tell us this. Scientists have drilled deep into the Antarctic ice sheet, extracting cylinders of ice that go back hundreds of thousands of years. By analyzing the chemicals and gases trapped in the ice, they can reconstruct ancient temperatures and atmospheric conditions. The oldest continuous ice core goes back 800,000 years. Through all those millennia, through multiple ice ages and warm periods, Antarctica remained ice-covered. But here's where it gets interesting. The ice cores only go back 800,000 years. That's a long time, certainly, but it's a fraction of the 34 million years that Antarctica has been frozen. What happened before that? How complete was the ice coverage during earlier warm periods? We know from geological evidence that Antarctica wasn't always as completely frozen as it is today. Fossils show that 50 million years ago, Antarctica had forests. Palm trees grew there. The climate was temperate, almost subtropical. But that was long before the ice sheet formed, long before modern humans evolved. What about more recently? Were there periods during the time humans have existed when parts of Antarctica were ice-free? The evidence suggests no. At least, not significantly ice-free. Perhaps small areas along the coast, perhaps a few ice-free valleys like the McMurdo dry valleys that exist today. But not enough to map extensive coastlines, not enough to show the geographic features that appear on the Piri Reis and other maps. Unless something dramatic happened. Unless there was a rapid climate event that temporarily reduced ice coverage, making coastal exploration possible for a brief period before the ice returned. This is where theories about catastrophic climate change come in. The Younger Dryas event is often mentioned in this context. Around 12,800 years ago, right at the end of the last ice age when temperatures were warming and glaciers were retreating, something happened. Global temperatures suddenly plummeted. dropping by as much as 15 degrees Celsius in some regions. In Greenland, the temperature change might have occurred in just a few decades. The Younger Dryas lasted for about 1,200 years, a mini ice age interrupting the warming trend. Then, around 11,600 years ago, it ended just as abruptly. Temperatures shot up, glaciers melted rapidly, sea levels rose fast. What caused the Younger Dryas? Scientists aren't entirely sure. The leading theory involves changes in ocean circulation, possibly triggered by massive amounts of glacial meltwater flooding into the North Atlantic and disrupting the Gulf Stream. Another theory, more controversial, suggests a comet impact or airburst over North America, causing widespread fires and throwing dust into the atmosphere that cooled the climate. Whatever the cause, the Younger Dryas was real. It happened. It was a dramatic, rapid climate event that affected the entire world. Could it have temporarily affected Antarctica's ice cover? Could coastal areas have become more accessible during this period, either during the warming phase before the Younger Dryas, or during the rapid warming that followed it? It's a stretch. Antarctica is far from the North Atlantic, where the Younger Dryas had its strongest effects. The Antarctic ice sheet is so massive, so stable, that short-term climate fluctuations don't dramatically change its extent. But perhaps on the margins, perhaps in coastal areas, there could have been changes. Perhaps areas that are now under ice were briefly exposed. Perhaps during the rapid sea level rise after the Younger Dryas, coastal geography was temporarily visible before being covered again. This is speculation piled on speculation, but it's at least physically possible, unlike the claim that Antarctica was completely ice-free within the last million years. There's another angle to consider. Maybe the maps don't show ice-free Antarctica. Maybe they show Antarctica with ice, but with more coastal detail visible because sea levels were lower during the last glacial maximum. When sea levels were 400 feet lower, Antarctica's coastline extended further out. The continental shelf was exposed. There was more land above water, even if that land was covered in ice. Perhaps ancient mariners reached these ice-covered coasts and mapped them, and later cartographers, not understanding what they were copying, drew them as ice-free land. That could explain the maps. It doesn't require Antarctica to have been ice-free, just accessible enough for distant observation. But it still requires ancient voyages to Antarctic waters, still requires navigation capabilities we're not sure existed, still requires this knowledge to be preserved for thousands of years. The scientific consensus is clear. There's no evidence that Antarctica has been significantly ice-free during the time modern humans have existed. The ice core data, the geological evidence, the marine sediment cores all point to continuous glaciation for millions of years. If the maps show Antarctica, they're either showing features that can be determined from ice-covered observations, or they're based on much older information than we think possible, or they're not showing Antarctica at all and the similarities are coincidental. But the debate continues because the climate system is complex. We're still discovering how it works, still finding surprises in the geological record. Maybe there's something we don't know yet, some aspect of Antarctica's history that hasn't been discovered. Or maybe we need to look at this from a different angle entirely. Maybe the question isn't whether Antarctica was ice-free, but what catastrophic events might have disrupted ancient civilizations and erased their records. leaving only fragments preserved in maps and myths. Let's explore that possibility next. History has a way of disappearing. Libraries burn, cities crumble, civilizations collapse, and their knowledge vanishes with them. What survives is often random, a matter of luck and circumstance more than intentional preservation. The Library of Alexandria is the most famous example. Founded in the 3rd century BCE, it was the ancient world's greatest repository of knowledge. Hundreds of thousands of scrolls collected from across the Mediterranean and beyond. Works of philosophy, science, mathematics, literature, history. And then it was gone, destroyed, though we're not even entirely sure when or how. Perhaps burned during Julius Caesar's siege in 48 BCE. Perhaps gradually declined during the later Roman period. Perhaps finally destroyed when Muslim forces conquered Egypt in 641 CE. We don't know precisely what was lost. That's the nature of lost knowledge. You can't catalogue what you don't have. But we know from references in surviving texts that the library contained works that no longer exist. Plays by Sophocles and Euripides that we've never read. Scientific treatises by scholars whose names we barely know. Maps and geographic descriptions that might have shown places we'd find surprising. What if the library contained maps of Antarctica? Or source material that medieval cartographers would later use? We'll never know because it's gone. But it's not the only example of knowledge lost to catastrophe. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE saw multiple civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean destroyed almost simultaneously. The Mycenaeans, the Hittites, the Minoans, the city-states of the Levant all collapsed in a relatively short period. Cities were burned, populations scattered, literacy vanished for centuries. We're still not entirely sure what caused it. Was it war? Climate change? Economic collapse? A cascade of interconnected failures? Probably all of the above. The Bronze Age Mediterranean was a complex network of trade and diplomacy. When parts of it failed, the whole system unraveled, and knowledge was lost. Linear B, the script used by Mycenaean Greeks, wasn't deciphered until 1952. For 3,000 years, tablets written in this script sat in museums, unreadable. Who knows what information they contained? What might have been lost in the tablets that didn't survive? But let's go back further. Let's talk about the really big catastrophe, the one that reshaped the world at the end of the last ice age. Around 11,600 years ago, the Younger Dryas Cold period ended abruptly. Global temperatures spiked. Ice sheets that had covered vast areas suddenly began melting at an accelerated rate. Sea levels rose dramatically, not all at once, but over a period of several thousand years. The rise wasn't uniform or gentle. There's evidence of meltwater pulses, periods when ice sheets collapsed rapidly and dumped enormous amounts of water into the oceans, causing sea levels to jump by many feet in short periods. Imagine you're living on the coast during one of these events. Your village is built on a fertile plain near the sea. Fishing is good. Trade routes connect you to other communities. Life is stable. Then, over a few decades or even a few years, the water starts rising. Slowly at first, then faster. The plain floods. Your village has to move. You relocate to higher ground, but the water keeps coming. Again and again you have to move, abandoning homes, fields, temples. Eventually, the water stops rising. But by then, everything you knew is underwater. The coastal plains where most people lived where the best land was, where cities and trade networks existed. Gone. Submerged. This didn't happen in one place. It happened globally. Every coastline was affected. If there were advanced coastal civilizations during the Ice Age, they would have been devastated. And here's the thing about coastal civilizations. They don't leave much evidence behind when they're submerged. Organic materials decay. Wood rots. Even stone structures get covered by sediment, broken apart by waves, scattered until they're unrecognizable. If you wanted to hide an ancient civilization's ruins, you couldn't pick a better method than drowning them under 400 feet of water. This is why some researchers argue we need to look underwater to survey the continental shelves where the coastline used to be, searching for submerged ruins. Some work has been done, but it's expensive and technically challenging. The ocean floor is vast and mostly unexplored. But there's another type of catastrophe we need to consider. One that's more speculative but potentially more dramatic. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests that around 12,800 years ago, a comet or asteroid fragmenting as it entered Earth's atmosphere caused airbursts or impacts across North America and possibly other locations. The evidence is controversial and hotly debated, but it includes nanodiamonds in sediment layers dated to the right period. These form under extreme pressure and temperature consistent with impacts. A layer of platinum enrichment in ice cores suggesting extraterrestrial material. Evidence of widespread fires across North America at the Younger Dryas boundary. The sudden extinction of megafauna, mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, right around this time. If this impact happened, it would have been catastrophic. Not civilization ending on a global scale, but certainly civilization disrupting. Fires, floods from melting ice, climate chaos. Any advanced culture in North America would have been severely affected, and the effects would have been global. The impact might have triggered the Younger Dryas cold period, affecting the entire world's climate. It might have accelerated ice sheet collapse, contributing to the rapid sea level rise that followed. Could such an event have destroyed an advanced civilization? Could it have erased physical evidence of their existence while a few of their maps survived, copied by cultures that came after? It's possible. Not proven, but possible. There's another catastrophe worth mentioning, though it's not well documented. Ancient myths from multiple cultures speak of a great flood that destroyed the world. We've talked about these myths before, but it's worth emphasizing how universal they are and how consistent the details often are. Waters rising suddenly, divine warning, a chosen survivor building a vessel, the world drowning, a new beginning. If these myths preserve memories of real events, if they're cultural recollections of the sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age, then they're telling us something important. This was traumatic enough that cultures preserve the memory for 10,000 years or more. Trauma gets remembered. Catastrophe becomes legend. And sometimes, encoded in those legends, there's real information about real events. The Black Sea deluge is another potential candidate. Around 5,600 BCE, the Mediterranean Sea may have burst through the Bosphorus Strait and flooded what had been a freshwater lake, suddenly turning it into the saltwater Black Sea we know today. Geological evidence suggests this happened catastrophically, with water pouring through at enormous volume, flooding thousands of square miles of inhabited land in a matter of months or years. If true, this would have been a regional catastrophe of immense scale. Communities living around the Black Sea would have been forced to flee, abandoning everything, scattering to distant lands. They would have carried memories of the flood with them, stories that would have been told and retold, eventually entering the mythological traditions of multiple cultures. Could some of those refugees have carried maps with them? Knowledge of navigation, of distant lands, of geographic information that seems anomalous when we find it later? Perhaps. What all these catastrophes have in common is that they disrupt continuity. They break the chain of knowledge transmission. What survives is fragmentary, incomplete, often garbled through repeated copying and translation. Maybe that's what we're seeing with these anomalous maps. Maybe they're fragments of a more complete geographic knowledge that existed before catastrophe struck. Maybe ancient peoples knew more about the world than we give them credit for, and most of that knowledge was lost, with only tantalizing hints surviving in medieval maps that copied from older sources now gone. It's frustrating, really. The questions pile up, but the answers remain elusive. We're left with possibilities, with maybes and perhapses, with intriguing hints that never quite solidify into certainty. But maybe that's appropriate. Maybe some mysteries aren't meant to be solved conclusively. Maybe the best we can do is examine the evidence, consider the possibilities, and remain open to the idea that history is more complex, more surprising than our neat narratives suggest. So let's return to the central question. Could Antarctica have been visited or inhabited in ancient times? What would it take for that to be true? What evidence would we need? Let's explore that final question together. History has a way of disappearing. Libraries burn, cities crumble, civilizations collapse, and their knowledge vanishes with them. What survives is often random, a matter of luck and circumstance more than intentional preservation. The Library of Alexandria is the most famous example. Founded in the 3rd century BCE, it was the ancient world's greatest repository of knowledge. Hundreds of thousands of scrolls, collected from across the Mediterranean and beyond. Works of philosophy, science, mathematics, literature, history. And then it was gone, destroyed, though we're not even entirely sure when or how. Perhaps burned during Julius Caesar's siege in 48 BCE. Perhaps gradually declined during the later Roman period. Perhaps finally destroyed when Muslim forces conquered Egypt in 641 CE. We don't know precisely what was lost. That's the nature of lost knowledge. You can't catalogue what you don't have. But we know from references in surviving texts that the library contained works that no longer exist. Plays by Sophocles and Euripides that we've never read. Scientific treatises by scholars whose names we barely know. Maps and geographic descriptions that might have shown places we'd find surprising. What if the library contained maps of Antarctica, or source material that medieval cartographers would later use? We'll never know, because it's gone. But it's not the only example of knowledge lost to catastrophe. The Bronze Age collapse, around 1200 BCE, saw multiple civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean destroyed almost simultaneously. The Mycenaeans, the Hittites, the Minoans, the city-states of the Levant, all collapsed in a relatively short period. Cities were burned, populations scattered, literacy vanished for centuries. We're still not entirely sure what caused it. Was it war? Climate change? Economic collapse? A cascade of interconnected failures? Probably all of the above. The Bronze Age Mediterranean was a complex network of trade and diplomacy. When parts of it failed, the whole system unraveled, and knowledge was lost. Linear B, the script used by Mycenaean Greeks, wasn't deciphered until 1952. For 3,000 years, tablets written in this script sat in museums, unreadable. Who knows what information they contained, what might have been lost in the tablets that didn't survive. But let's go back further. Let's talk about the really big catastrophe, the one that reshaped the world at the end of the last ice age. Around 11,600 years ago, the Younger Dryas cold period ended abruptly. Global temperatures spiked. Ice sheets that had covered vast areas suddenly began melting at an accelerated rate. Sea levels rose dramatically, not all at once, but over a period of several thousand years. The rise wasn't uniform or gentle. There's evidence of meltwater pulses, periods when ice sheets collapsed rapidly and dumped enormous amounts of water into the oceans, causing sea levels to jump by many feet in short periods. Imagine you're living on the coast during one of these events. Your village is built on a fertile plain near the sea. Fishing is good. Trade routes connect you to other communities. Life is stable. Then, over a few decades or even a few years, the water starts rising. Slowly at first, then faster. The plain floods. Your village has to move. You relocate to higher ground, but the water keeps coming. Again and again you have to move, abandoning homes, fields, temples. Eventually, the water stops rising. But by then, everything you knew is underwater. The coastal plains where most people lived, where the best land was, where cities and trade networks existed. Gone. Submerged. This didn't happen in one place. It happened globally. Every coastline was affected. If there were advanced coastal civilizations during the Ice Age, they would have been devastated. And here's the thing about coastal civilizations. They don't leave much evidence behind when they're submerged. Organic materials decay. Wood rots. Even stone structures get covered by sediment, broken apart by waves, scattered until they're unrecognizable. If you wanted to hide an ancient civilization's ruins, you couldn't pick a better method than drowning them under 400 feet of water. This is why some researchers argue we need to look underwater to survey the continental shelves where the coastline used to be, searching for submerged ruins. Some work has been done, but it's expensive and technically challenging. The ocean floor is vast and mostly unexplored. But there's another type of catastrophe we need to consider, one that's more speculative but potentially more dramatic. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests that around 12,800 years ago, a comet or asteroid fragmenting as it entered Earth's atmosphere caused airbursts or impacts across North America and possibly other locations. The evidence is controversial and hotly debated, but it includes nanodiamonds in sediment layers dated to the right period. These form under extreme pressure and temperature, consistent with impacts. A layer of platinum enrichment in ice cores, suggesting extraterrestrial material. Evidence of widespread fires across North America at the Younger Dryas boundary. The sudden extinction of megafauna, mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, right around this time. If this impact happened, it would have been catastrophic. Not civilization ending on a global scale, but certainly civilization disrupting. Fires, floods from melting ice, climate chaos. Any advanced culture in North America would have been severely affected. And the effects would have been global. The impact might have triggered the Younger Dryas cold period, affecting the entire world's climate. It might have accelerated ice sheet collapse, contributing to the rapid sea level rise that followed. Could such an event have destroyed an advanced civilization? Could it have erased physical evidence of their existence, while a few of their maps survived, copied by cultures that came after? It's possible. Not proven, but possible. There's another catastrophe worth mentioning, though it's not well documented. Ancient myths from multiple cultures speak of a great flood that destroyed the world. We've talked about these myths before, but it's worth emphasizing how universal they are and how consistent the details often are. Waters rising suddenly, divine warning, a chosen survivor building a vessel, the world drowning, a new beginning. If these myths preserve memories of real events, if they're cultural recollections of the sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age, then they're telling us something important. This was traumatic enough that cultures preserve the memory for 10,000 years or more. Trauma gets remembered. Catastrophe becomes legend. And sometimes, encoded in those legends, there's real information about real events. The Black Sea deluge is another potential candidate. Around 5,600 BCE, the Mediterranean Sea may have burst through the Bosphorus Strait and flooded what had been a freshwater lake, suddenly turning it into the saltwater Black Sea we know today. Geological evidence suggests this happened catastrophically, with water pouring through at enormous volume, flooding thousands of square miles of inhabited land in a matter of months or years. If true, this would have been a regional catastrophe of immense scale. Communities living around the Black Sea would have been forced to flee, abandoning everything, scattering to distant lands. They would have carried memories of the flood with them, stories that would have been told and retold, eventually entering the mythological traditions of multiple cultures. Could some of those refugees have carried maps with them? Knowledge of navigation, of distant lands, of geographic information that seems anomalous when we find it later? Perhaps. What all these catastrophes have in common is that they disrupt continuity. They break the chain of knowledge transmission. What survives is fragmentary, incomplete, often garbled through repeated copying and translation. Maybe that's what we're seeing with these anomalous maps. Maybe they're fragments of a more complete geographic knowledge that existed before catastrophe struck. Maybe ancient peoples knew more about the world than we give them credit for, and most of that knowledge was lost, with only tantalizing hints surviving in medieval maps that copied from older sources now gone. It's frustrating, really. The questions pile up, but the answers remain elusive. We're left with possibilities, with maybes and perhapses, with intriguing hints that never quite solidify into certainty. But maybe that's appropriate. Maybe some mysteries aren't meant to be solved conclusively. Maybe the best we can do is examine the evidence, consider the possibilities, and remain open to the idea that history is more complex, more surprising than our neat narratives suggest. So let's return to the central question. Could Antarctica have been visited or inhabited in ancient times? What would it take for that to be true? What evidence would we need? Let's explore that final question together. Let's be clear about what we're really asking here. We're not asking whether ancient peoples built cities on Antarctica, whether they colonized the frozen continent and lived there year-round. That's almost certainly impossible given what we know about the climate. Even during warm periods, even at the edges of the ice sheet, Antarctica would have been inhospitable to permanent human settlement without modern technology. What we're asking is more modest. Could ancient seafarers have reached Antarctica, even briefly? Could they have explored parts of its coastline, mapped what they saw, and returned home with that information? That's a different question. And the answer might be maybe. The Southern Ocean is one of the most dangerous bodies of water on Earth. The latitudes south of 40 degrees are known as the Roaring Forties for their relentless westerly winds. Below 50 degrees, you enter the Furious 50s, where the wind rarely stops and waves can build to monstrous heights. There's no land to break up the waves until you reach Antarctica. They circle the globe endlessly, building and building, creating some of the most violent sea conditions anywhere. Mariners, even today, treat these waters with respect. Could ancient ships survive here? Phoenician vessels? Polynesian outriggers? Greek triremes? It seems unlikely. These were coastal craft designed for Mediterranean or Pacific conditions. Taking them into the Southern Ocean would be suicidal, unless they were blown there by accident. Unless a storm caught them, drove them south, and they couldn't turn back. Ships have been known to survive remarkable journeys when the alternative is death. Desperation is a powerful motivator. If a ship ended up in Antarctic waters by accident, what would the crew have seen? Ice. Certainly ice. Icebergs drift north from Antarctica, some massive enough to survive for years. A ship approaching the continent would have encountered them long before seeing land. The coast itself, in most places, is an ice wall. Glaciers flow down from the interior, reaching the sea and forming ice shelves that can extend hundreds of miles from the actual rock coastline. But in some places, rock does appear. Mountains poke through the ice. In a few locations, like the McMurdo Dry Valleys, the landscape is relatively ice-free due to local wind patterns. If ancient mariners reached one of these ice-free or partially ice-free areas, they might have been able to land briefly, explore a bit, and record what they saw before the cold and the dangers forced them to leave. The cold would have been the biggest challenge. Ancient peoples weren't equipped for polar conditions. They had no insulated clothing, no heated shelter, no way to combat frostbite and hypothermia except fire and natural materials. Even a brief landing would have been dangerous, but possible, survivable if they didn't stay long. If such a voyage happened, if a ship reached Antarctica and some of its crews survived to return home, what would they have reported? Strange coastlines unlike anything in the known world. Ice and snow, cold beyond imagination. Perhaps some geographic features. Mountains, valleys, rivers flowing from glaciers to the sea in summer. That information, passed down through oral tradition, eventually written down, copied by cartographers who didn't understand its significance, might have ended up on medieval maps as an unexplained southern coastline that cartographers tried to make sense of, using whatever tools and theories they had available. It's a scenario that requires a lot of luck and a lot of things going right. But it's not impossible. What about habitation? Could anyone have lived on Antarctica even temporarily? In historical times, we have examples of people surviving in extremely harsh conditions. The Inuit and other Arctic peoples thrived in the far north through ingenious adaptations. They built shelters from ice and snow, hunted seals and whales, developed clothing that could protect against extreme cold. But they had thousands of years to develop these technologies. They had rich oral traditions teaching each generation what worked and what didn't. They had access to resources like whale oil and seal blubber for heat and light. Someone arriving at Antarctica without this knowledge, without these tools, would have struggled to survive even a single winter. And why would they stay? There's nothing there to sustain permanent habitation. No trees for building or fuel. No large animals to hunt except penguins and seals, which would be unfamiliar prey. No reason to endure such hardship. But temporary camps, research stations, essentially, before we had that terminology? Perhaps. If an ancient civilization was systematically exploring the world, mapping coastlines for navigation purposes, they might have established temporary bases at key locations, including Antarctica. Not permanent settlements, just places where expeditions could shelter, resupply, and prepare for the return journey. Such camps would leave minimal archaeological evidence, especially if they were on or near glaciers that have since flowed into the sea. Temporary structures, organic materials, all of it would be gone, either carried away by ice or buried so deeply beneath layers of ice and snow that we'd never find it. The only evidence that would survive would be the maps themselves, copied and recopied, their origins forgotten, but their information preserved. This is all speculation. I want to be clear about that. We have no hard evidence of ancient Antarctic exploration. No artifacts, no ruins, no definitive proof. What we have are anomalous maps, suggestive legends, and a lot of questions that conventional history struggles to answer convincingly. The scientific consensus is that Antarctica was not visited or inhabited by humans until the 19th century. That the maps showing Antarctic features either don't actually show Antarctica or are based on theoretical geography that happen to be partially correct by chance. That's probably the right answer. Probably. But the word probably leaves room for doubt. And in that space, mystery thrives. Maybe future discoveries will resolve these questions. Maybe we'll find evidence underwater on the continental shelves that shows ancient peoples traveled more extensively than we realize. Maybe ice core studies will reveal that Antarctica's ice coverage varied more than we think, creating windows of opportunity for coastal exploration. Or maybe we'll determine conclusively that the maps are misinterpreted, that the similarities to Antarctica are coincidental, that the mystery was never really a mystery at all. Until then, we're left with what we have: fragmentary evidence, intriguing possibilities, questions that refuse to go away no matter how many times they're supposedly answered. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the value isn't in solving the mystery, but in remaining curious, in questioning our assumptions, in staying open to the possibility that history might surprise us. Let's conclude our journey through these Antarctic mysteries by reflecting on what they mean, what they tell us about knowledge and memory, and the long shadow the past casts into our present. It's late now, or early, depending on where you are. If you're still with me, still listening to this journey through old maps and older mysteries, I want to thank you. These aren't easy questions we've been exploring. They exist in uncomfortable spaces, in the gaps between what we know and what we wish we knew, between certainty and speculation. The Piri Reis Map still sits in its museum in Istanbul, carefully preserved behind climate-controlled glass. Scholars still study it, still debate what it shows, still publish papers, arguing one interpretation or another, The map hasn't changed in 500 years, but our understanding of it shifts constantly, reflecting what we want to find more than what's actually there. Maybe that's the real lesson of all this. Maybe these maps function less as objective historical documents and more as mirrors, reflecting our desires, our theories, our willingness to believe that the world is stranger and more mysterious than conventional wisdom suggests. The mainstream explanation is straightforward. The Piri Reis Map shows South America distorted and extended too far south, because Piri was working from imperfect sources and making educated guesses to fill in the blank spaces. The Orontius Phineas map and the Boache map show theoretical geography, imagined southern continents based on Greek ideas about symmetry and balance. The mathematical sophistication isn't as advanced as it seems once you account for knowledge that existed in the ancient world but wasn't widely preserved in medieval Europe. And Antarctica. Antarctica has been frozen for 34 million years, uninhabited until Russian and British explorers confirmed its existence in the 19th century, unexplored until the heroic age of Antarctic exploration in the early 20th century. Any similarities between ancient maps and Antarctic geography are coincidental, pattern-seeking humans seeing what they want to see. That explanation works. It's simple, it's logical, it doesn't require any impossible assumptions, but it doesn't entirely satisfy, does it? Because those rivers keep flowing in the right places. The mountains keep appearing where mountains exist beneath the ice. The Boache map keeps showing Antarctica divided into two land masses, a fact that wasn't scientifically confirmed until seismic surveys could see through miles of ice in the 1950s. Coincidence piles on coincidence until you start to wonder if maybe, possibly, there's something more going on. I don't have answers for you. I promised at the beginning that this wasn't a story with neat conclusions, and I meant it. What I can offer is perspective, a way of thinking about these mysteries that doesn't require choosing between certainty and wild speculation. Knowledge is fragile. That's the first thing to understand. Civilizations collapse. Libraries burn, traditions get interrupted. What survives is often random. The fact that we don't have evidence of something doesn't mean it didn't exist. It might just mean we haven't found the evidence yet, or that the evidence was lost, or that we're looking in the wrong places. The ancient world was more connected than we often assume. Trade networks stretched across continents. Information flowed along those networks, sometimes traveling thousands of miles. What the Chinese knew might eventually reach the Mediterranean. What the Polynesians discovered might influence Indian Ocean navigation. Knowledge was shared, copied, adapted. If someone, somewhere, somehow reached Antarctic waters and brought back information about what they'd seen, that information could have spread, been copied onto maps, been preserved in fragments even as its origin story was forgotten or garbled. That doesn't require an advanced Ice Age civilization. It doesn't require alien intervention or impossible technology. It just requires human curiosity, accidents of navigation, and the preservation of information through normal cultural transmission. Is that what happened? I don't know. Nobody knows. But it's possible. And in the absence of certainty, possibility is what we have. There's something beautiful about unsolved mysteries. They remind us that despite all our satellites and databases and scientific instruments, we don't know everything. There are still gaps in our understanding, still questions without clear answers, still room for wonder. The Piri Reis Map invites us to wonder. It sits there, this fragment of gazelle skin with its careful lines and faded colors, quietly suggesting that maybe the world is more complex than our histories admit. Maybe ancient peoples traveled further than we realize. Maybe knowledge has been lost and partially recovered more times than we can count. Maybe the past still has secrets it hasn't revealed. I find that comforting in a strange way. The idea that history isn't finished, isn't a closed book, that new discoveries might change our understanding of what came before. We're living in a time when new technologies are revolutionizing archaeology. Satellite imagery can spot ruins beneath jungle canopy. LiDAR can map landscapes through forest cover. Sonar surveys are revealing details of the ocean floor that were invisible just decades ago. Maybe one day we'll find something on the continental shelf, some submerged site that dates to the Ice Age, that shows ancient peoples were more sophisticated than we thought. Maybe we'll discover new texts in some dusty archive that clarify where those anomalous maps came from. Or maybe the mystery will remain unsolved. Maybe we'll never know for certain what the Piri Reis Map shows, or where its information originated. And maybe that's okay. Mystery has value. It keeps us curious. It prevents us from becoming too confident in our narratives about the past. It reminds us that there's always more to learn, always new questions to ask, always the possibility that the next discovery might change everything. So where does that leave us? With a map. A fragmentary, ambiguous, endlessly fascinating map that might show Antarctica or might not. That might preserve ancient knowledge or might be an elaborate coincidence. With questions that have been debated for decades and will probably be debated for decades more. And with the understanding that sometimes the journey is more valuable than the destination, that exploring these mysteries, even without reaching definitive answers, expands our sense of what's possible, what might have been, what could still be discovered. The frozen continent sits at the bottom of the world, holding whatever secrets it holds, wrapped in ice and time and silence. Maybe ancient peoples saw its coasts. Maybe they mapped it. Maybe their knowledge somehow survived the long journey through centuries and cultures to reach us in fragmentary form. Or maybe we're just seeing patterns in randomness, finding meaning in coincidence, telling ourselves stories because that's what humans do. Either way, the mystery endures. The questions remain. And somewhere out there, in libraries and archives and museums, other fragments wait to be discovered. Other maps, other texts, other hints at knowledge lost and partially preserved. The search continues. The debate goes on. And the ice keeps its secrets, at least for now. Thank you for wandering through these mysteries with me, for staying curious, for being willing to sit with uncertainty and ambiguity rather than demanding easy answers. If this journey through cartographic, puzzles, and frozen continents has sparked something in you, drop a comment about which ancient mystery you'd like to explore next. Maybe we'll dive into other impossible artifacts, other maps that shouldn't exist, other hints that the ancient world knew more than we give them credit for. Until then, keep questioning, keep wondering, keep looking at the world with fresh eyes. Because sometimes the oldest mysteries are the ones that have the most to teach us about who we are and where we came from. And sometimes a 500-year-old map drawn on gazelle skin can still whisper secrets across the centuries if we're willing to listen. Thank you for joining us at Lunar History Vault, where history's mysteries never quite rest.